Today, we're going to get into the physics of one of the most infamous disasters in human history, Chernobyl. We're going to look past the headlines and really dig into the mechanics of what happened on that night in April 1986.
You have to imagine the scene in that control room. Amid all the chaos, with the building literally falling apart around them, this was the gut reaction. The engineers, the people who knew this machine better than anyone, were absolutely convinced that what they just saw couldn't happen. From their understanding of physics, a reactor core just wasn't supposed to explode like a bomb. And that's the central mystery we're tackling. How does a machine built for controlled, steady power generation suddenly become a weapon of immense destruction? The answer, as we'll see, is baked right into the reactor's design, its atomic heart, and, most importantly, a couple of very dangerous secrets. So, let's get into it. To really understand how it broke, you first have to understand how it was supposed to work. The reactor at Chernobyl was an RBMK type. This thing was a workhorse for the Soviet nuclear program. It was powerful and, maybe most importantly, it was cheap to build and run. But that focus on saving money, well, it came with a hidden cost. Let's break down the basics.
Okay, so it all starts with this core concept, nuclear fission. It's actually pretty simple in principle. You take a big, unstable atom like uranium-235 and you split it apart. When it splits, it releases an absolutely massive amount of energy in the form of heat. You use that heat to boil water, that steam spins a turbine, and bingo, you've got electricity.
So how do you get a continuous supply of energy? Through a chain reaction. Think of a single neutron as a tiny little bullet. When it hits a uranium atom, that atom splits, releasing heat, but it also releases 2 or 3 new neutron bullets. Those new neutrons fly out and hit other uranium atoms, and the process just repeats itself, growing bigger and bigger, faster and faster. This is the engine of the reactor.
Now, an uncontrolled chain reaction, well, that's a nuclear bomb. So you obviously have to control it. The RBMK reactor had 2 main tools for this job. First, you have a graphite moderator. Its job is to slow down those neutron bullets, which, counterintuitively, makes them more likely to cause fission. So the graphite acts like the accelerator. Then, to slow things down, you have control rods made of boron. Boron is great at just soaking up neutrons, stopping them in their tracks. So the boron rods are the brakes. In a perfect world, you find a balance between the accelerator and the brakes, and you get steady, controlled power.
But, and this is where it all starts to go horribly wrong, because hidden inside the design of this reactor, a design that was all about being cheap and powerful, were 2 absolutely catastrophic flaws. And here's the worst part. The designers knew about them, but the operators, the guys running the plant day in and day out, were never told.
The first flaw is just, it's completely backward. Imagine if your car became more likely to explode the slower you drove it. It makes no sense, right? Well, that was the RBMK. When you tried to run it at low power, it became incredibly unstable and dangerous. And this was all because of something called a positive void coefficient.
In pretty much any modern reactor, if things get too hot, the reaction naturally slows down. It's a safety feature built into the physics. The RBMK did the exact opposite. As the cooling water inside got hotter and turned into steam, creating these empty pockets or voids, the nuclear reaction didn't slow down, it sped up. So you get this terrifying feedback loop. More heat creates more steam voids, which in turn speeds up the reaction, which creates even more heat. It's a runaway train.
So, if the accelerator is stuck on, what about the brakes? The control rods that are supposed to shut the whole thing down? Well, this brings us to the second, and arguably the most lethal flaw in the whole design. The emergency shutdown system itself had a terrible secret. Okay, let's walk through this, because it's absolutely crucial. When an operator hits the AZ5 button, the big red button for an emergency shutdown, the boron control rods start lowering into the core to absorb neutrons and kill the reaction. But, and this is insane, the ends of the rods were tipped with graphite, the accelerator. So for a few critical seconds as the rods were going in, the graphite tips entered the core first. This displaced water and caused a massive, sudden spike in the reaction, right before the boron part of the rod could get in there to do its job. It was literally like slamming on the gas pedal right before you hit the brakes.
So let's just recap. You've got a reactor that's unstable when you run it slow. And you've got an emergency shutdown button that can briefly make things much, much worse. This thing was a ticking time bomb. And on the night of April 25th, 1986, a series of human errors during a safety test created the absolute perfect conditions for that bomb to go off.
First, the safety test gets delayed for almost 9 hours, so the reactor is just sitting there in that unstable, half-power state for way too long. When they finally get the green light, it's the middle of the night, and a new, less experienced crew has taken over. They're under a ton of pressure to get this test done. Then, the power level suddenly crashes. This happens because of something called xenon poisoning. Basically, a byproduct of the fission process builds up and starts absorbing neutrons, stalling the reactor. To fight this and get the power back up, the operators make a terrible decision, one that broke all the rules. They pulled out almost every single control rod, leaving the reactor with practically no brakes at all.
So let's just pause here and take stock of the situation. Right before the explosion, this reactor was in the most dangerous condition you could possibly imagine. It was running at a dangerously low power level where its physics were known to be unstable. Its automatic safety systems had been turned off for the test, and its brakes, the control rods, had been almost completely removed from the core. It was a loaded weapon with the safety off, just waiting for a trigger.
The stage was set, the physics of the machine, the human errors, it was a perfect storm. All it needed was one final push to send it over the edge. And the terrible irony is that that final push came from the one button that was supposed to prevent a disaster.
So the test begins, and immediately that positive void coefficient kicks in. Water in the core flashes into steam, and the power starts to spike hard. On the control panel, Shift Supervisor Akimov sees the dials going haywire. He does exactly what he was trained to do. He slams the AZ5 button to shut the reactor down.
And that's the moment. The one action that should have saved them sealed their fate. As those 200 control rods began their descent, their graphite tips entered the already boiling, unstable bottom of the core. And that design flaw, the accelerator on the end of the brake pedal, triggered an instantaneous, unbelievable power surge.
In just a few seconds, the reactor's power level shot up to an estimated 33,000 megawatts. To put that in perspective, that is more than 10 times the reactor's maximum designed output. It was a release of energy that the structure was never ever meant to contain.
All that energy instantly vaporized what was left of the cooling water. The result was a massive steam explosion that blew the 2,000-ton steel and concrete lid, they called it the biological shield, straight up off the reactor. The core was now open to the air, and the superheated graphite inside immediately caught fire, starting a nuclear inferno that would burn for 10 days, spewing radiation across the world.
The physically impossible had just happened. A fatal flaw in the reactor's design, a secret that had been kept for years, was just revealed to the entire planet in the most violent and horrific way you can imagine. And just to give you a sense of the scale here, the amount of radioactive material that fire released in just the first 10 days was at least 10 times greater than the fallout from the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. This wasn't a single event, it was a continuous volcano of radioactive poison. So this leaves us with a really difficult question. Yes, the operators made mistakes, absolutely undeniable mistakes. But can we really put all the blame on them? Or were they just the final link in a chain that was forged by a dangerously flawed design and a culture of secrecy that put production targets ahead of safety? It's a chilling reminder that sometimes the biggest danger isn't in the technology itself, but in the choices people make. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.
We're going back to a silent night in April 1986. A night that, for the people at that power plant, and really for the entire world, would never, ever end.
So here's how we'll break it down. We're going to track this countdown in 6 parts, starting with the test itself and following it all the way to the horrifying moment the reactor core was blown wide open.
Okay, so it's the middle of the night, April 25th, 1986. The operators in Reactor 4 are getting ready to run a safety test. But what exactly were they trying to do?
The idea was actually pretty straightforward. If there was a total blackout, the backup diesel generators took about a minute to fire up. A full minute is an eternity for a nuclear reactor without cooling. So the test was designed to see if the turbines, just spinning down on their own momentum, could generate enough juice to power the cooling pumps and bridge that really critical gap.
So how could a test like this, one they'd even tried before, go so horribly wrong? Well, the answer wasn't just in the control room that night. It was literally built into the DNA of the reactor itself. You see, the RBMK 1000 was the pride and joy of the Soviet nuclear program. But it was built with secrets, with shortcuts, with deeply dangerous instabilities that were kept hidden from the very people running it day in and day out.
And this right here shows the 3 big ones. First, what's called a positive void coefficient. All you need to know is that it means the hotter the reactor got, the more power it produced, a terrifying feedback loop. Second, the emergency shutdown rods had graphite tips, so for a few crucial seconds, they actually worked like an accelerator. And finally, there was no reinforced containment building, no last line of defense. It was like driving a car that speeds up when you hit the brakes and also has no airbags.
Now let's go into that control room on April 26 and see how a series of mistakes, all driven by pressure and that flawed design, created the absolute perfect storm.
The test got delayed by 10 hours. This was huge. It meant an unprepared night shift had to take over. And because the reactor was running at half power for so long, a substance called xenon-135 built up. Think of it like a poison that was strangling the reaction. So when they finally tried to lower the power for the test, the reactor just stalled. The power level crashed.
Panicked and being pushed hard by their abrasive boss, Anatoly Dyatlov, the operators made a terrible choice. To fight that xenon poison and get the power back up, they started pulling out the control rods, the reactor's brakes, way beyond the minimum safety limit. At this point, they were flying completely blind. They rustled the power back up to 200 megawatts, which was still way below the safe minimum of 700. The reactor was now a wild beast, unstable, incredibly difficult to control, and stripped of almost all its safety measures. Alarms were blaring, but they were ignored. Then, at 1:23 in the morning, against all common sense, Dyatlov ordered them to start the test. As soon as the test started, water in the core started boiling into steam, and that's when the positive void coefficient kicked in. More steam meant more power, which meant even more steam. In seconds, the reactor was a runaway train. The shift supervisor, Akimov, had only one move left. At 1:23 and 40 seconds, Akimov slammed the AZ5 button. This was it, the big red emergency shutdown button. It was supposed to instantly drop all 211 control rods into the core and kill the reaction. It was designed to be the ultimate failsafe.
But it wasn't. Because of that hidden flaw, the tips of the control rods were graphite. So for a split second, as they entered that volatile core, they didn't slow the reaction, they accelerated it, massively. The emergency brake had become a gas pedal. The power surge was so intense it warped the inside of the reactor, jamming the rods just a third of the way in.
In those few seconds, that fail-safe button didn't just fail to work, it triggered the very catastrophe it was supposed to prevent.
The power inside the reactor spiked to at least 10 times its maximum output. That colossal burst of energy instantly flashed all the cooling water in the core into steam.
And the pressure from that was just immense. Now this was a steam explosion, not a nuclear one like a bomb. That was impossible. Instead, this massive steam explosion just ripped the reactor apart, blowing the 2,000-ton steel lid straight up into the air. A second, even bigger explosion came moments later as hydrogen ignited, completely destroying the building.
In just a few seconds, the core of Reactor 4 was gone. The explosion had torn the building to shreds, exposing the glowing, superheated heart of the reactor to the night sky.
The graphite inside the core, now exposed to oxygen, immediately caught fire. For the next 10 days, that fire would pump a continuous plume of radioactive material high into the atmosphere, releasing contamination equal to about 400 Hiroshima bombs.
Back in what was left of the control room, there was just total disbelief. When a worker stumbled in and reported seeing the open core, Dyatlov refused to believe it, snapping that it was impossible for an RBMK core to explode. But the impossible had just happened.
And that leaves us with this tragic paradox, doesn't it? The operators, under incredible pressure, they broke safety rule after safety rule. But they were working with a machine that had a hidden, fatal flaw, a failsafe that could, under these very specific conditions, turn into a detonator. It really leaves you with the central haunting question of Chernobyl. Who was to blame? The men who broke the rules, or the state that built a reactor with a lie at its very core?
The first call that went out sounded, well, deceptively simple: fire on the roof. For firefighters like Vasily Ignatenko, this was just the job, another day at the office. They were trained to fight fires, not to fight the atom itself. They had absolutely no idea they weren't running towards a simple roof fire, but straight into the exposed radioactive heart of a nuclear reactor.
And the human side of this is it's heartbreaking. As Vasily was leaving, he told his pregnant wife Lyudmila not to worry, that the real danger was just the fire on the roof. And he believed it. They all did.
They honestly thought the worst thing they were up against was some burning tar, not this invisible enemy that was already, at that very moment, tearing their bodies apart from the inside out.
So, okay, while these men are bravely climbing up ladders, spraying water on what they think is just a fire, what was the real threat? What were they actually walking into? Because it definitely wasn't the flames. It was something silent, you couldn't smell it, and it was completely and utterly lethal. The real enemy here was ionizing radiation. What that means, basically, is that the explosion had turned the reactor core into a cloud of subatomic particles, and these particles were now shooting out at nearly the speed of light, and they could just pass through concrete, steel, and of course, human tissue, like they weren't even there.
Valery Legasov, he was the lead scientist who investigated Chernobyl, and he came up with this perfect, terrifying analogy. I mean, think about that for a second. Not just one bullet, but billions upon billions of microscopic bullets, shredding your cells from the inside. That is what those firefighters were walking through, with absolutely no protection.
And it didn't take long for the first signs to show up. This metallic taste that so many of them reported, that was the taste of the radiation ionizing the atoms in their own saliva and airways. Their bodies were literally, physically reacting to this nuclear assault. For so many of them, this was the beginning of the end.
To make things even worse, the plant's supervisors were in total shock and denial. Their first report said radiation levels were at 3.6 rongtons per hour. Now, the reality? On the reactor roof, it was closer to 15,000 rongtons per hour. To put that in perspective for you, that's about 150 sieverts. A dose of just 4 or 5 sieverts is fatal for about half the people who receive it. These guys were absorbing a lethal dose every couple of minutes. The failure to get accurate information out was catastrophic.
So what does that much radiation actually do to a person's body? Well, there's a medical term for it, acute radiation syndrome, or ARS. And it's basically the body's agonizing step-by-step process of completely shutting down after receiving a massive fatal dose.
ARS comes in 3 really horrifying stages. First, you've got the initial shock. The body just reacts violently, vomiting, nausea, and the skin turns this deep red, like a nuclear sunburn. Then comes the latency period. This is the cruel part, because the victim actually starts to feel better, but on the inside, their cells are literally disintegrating. And finally, there's the manifest illness. This is where the body just collapses. The immune system is gone, the bone marrow is dead, the organs start to liquefy. It's an unimaginable way to die.
And that's exactly what started happening right there on the ground. The men who fought that fire, the ones who walked through the radioactive graphite scattered everywhere, they were already deep into the first stage of ARS before the sun even came up. Their fate was already sealed.
This timeline really puts the human cost into perspective. Look at this. The firefighters show up in 5 minutes. Within just a couple of hours, their bodies are already failing. And yet, for 36 hours, as this deadly radioactive cloud just drifts over the city, the 50,000 people of Pripyat were told nothing. They just went about their day. Kids were playing outside, all while being showered in radioactive fallout.
28. That's the number. In just the first few weeks after the explosion, 28 first responders, firefighters, and plant workers died from acute radiation syndrome. Men like Vasily Ignatenko suffered through all 3 of those horrible stages, dying in absolute agony in a Moscow hospital just 14 days later.
And you know, the horror didn't even end when they died. The bodies of those first victims were so saturated with radiation that they were still a danger to the living. They had to be buried in sealed zinc coffins under thick slabs of concrete because their own remains were a source of deadly contamination.
These men, through a sacrifice they didn't even know they were making, they prevented the fire from spreading to the other reactors. If that had happened, a huge part of Europe would have been uninhabitable. Their story is just this brutal, gut-wrenching reminder of the human cost of technology and how thin that line is between progress and total catastrophe. So it makes you wonder, what does their legacy teach us about how we manage these powerful and often invisible forces that we unleash on the world?
So after the explosion, Reactor 4 wasn't a power plant anymore. It was more like an open volcano. Just think about that. A volcano spewing a constant, invisible fire of radioactive particles straight up into the atmosphere, ready to be carried across continents. The core itself was just sitting there, completely exposed, burning at over 2,000 degrees Celsius.
You know, the first reports coming out of the control room were that radiation was at 3.6 rongtons per hour. Now that's alarming, sure, but it's manageable. The terrifying reality, though, was that their dosimeters just couldn't read any higher. They were maxed out. When they finally brought in a military-grade device that could handle the truth,
It gave a reading of 15,000 roentgens an hour. To give you some perspective, just 500 roentgens is a lethal dose. This was 30 times that every single hour.
And this is what made the threat so different, so much more insidious. A nuclear bomb, as horrifying as it is a single event. It happens, and it's over. But Chernobyl was a catastrophe that just kept happening. As the lead investigator, Valery Legasov, put it, that open core was pumping out the radiation equivalent of one Hiroshima bomb every single hour. And it wasn't going to stop. It was threatening to poison the entire continent.
Okay, so the core is burning, and the roof is just littered with these huge chunks of super radioactive graphite from inside the reactor. The number one job was to clear that debris and get it back into the reactor core. And of course, the most logical way to do that in a nuclear disaster is to send in the robots.
And they brought out the big guns. The Soviets gathered this really impressive fleet of machines. They had STR-1 lunar rovers, yeah, the ones literally designed to go to the moon, and repurposed them for this mission. They even managed to get sophisticated police robots from West Germany, including one nicknamed Joker, plus a bunch of remote-controlled bulldozers. The plan seemed pretty straightforward. Just push all that radioactive rubble off the roof from a safe distance.
But here's where the plan completely fell apart. The radiation on that roof wasn't just a threat to living things, it was absolutely lethal to electronics. The intense gamma rays just bombarded the microchips and circuits, essentially frying them from the inside out. The machines were going into this invisible war zone completely blind and deaf.
The story of that German robot Joker is the perfect example of this catastrophic failure. See, to avoid causing a huge international panic, and probably a little bit of embarrassment, the Soviet Union told their German counterparts that the radiation levels were way lower than they actually were. So, this advanced, expensive robot was deployed onto the roof, and it just died almost instantly. Its electronics were completely shredded by a level of radiation it was never ever designed to handle. With all of their most advanced machines now totally useless, the Soviet Commission had to make a really grim, almost unthinkable decision. If the machines couldn't do the job, then human beings would have to. And this was the moment the Biorobots were born.
And let's be clear, these weren't volunteers. They were mostly young soldiers, conscripted into the army, who were now being ordered to carry out what was, for all intents and purposes, a suicide mission. Even the name they were given, Biorobot, is just chilling. It reduces a person to a simple biological machine, a disposable tool that could be programmed for one single deadly task.
Just look at the battlefield they were sent into. The roof was split into different zones and they were given these eerily casual girls' names. The least dangerous area, Katya, had radiation levels of 1,000 roentgens an hour. That's a lethal dose in less than 30 minutes. But the most dangerous zone, Masha, right over the exposed reactor, was measuring up to 12,000 roentgens. If you stood there for just 2 minutes, your life expectancy was essentially cut in half.
So time became everything. It was the only defense they had, to stop them from dropping dead on the spot, and to try and limit their exposure to a so-called lifetime limit. Each soldier was given an absolute maximum of 90 seconds on that roof, and on the hottest spots, like Masha, that window shrank to a terrifying 30 or 40 seconds. That's it. And this was the mission. That's all it was. You run out from behind cover, you dig your shovel into the radioactive graphite, you throw it over the edge into the gaping wound of the reactor core, and then you run back. One shovelful. Maybe, if you were really fast, you could get 2. And for that one single act, they absorbed the dose of radiation that would permanently, irrevocably, damage their DNA.
Once the roof was finally painstakingly cleared by the biorobots, the next monumental task began. They had to contain that molten core and entomb the entire reactor building in a massive shell of concrete and steel, a structure that would forever be known as the sarcophagus.
But before they could build up, they actually had to dig down. Scientists were terrified that the molten core, this radioactive lava, would just burn its way through the concrete floor and hit these massive pools of water underneath, which would have caused a second, maybe even more powerful steam explosion. To stop that from happening, they brought in 400 coal miners to dig a tunnel under the reactor. They worked around the clock in 50-degree heat, that's 122 Fahrenheit, and high radiation, often working completely naked because the heat was just so unbearable. Their mission: install a giant heat exchanger to cool the ground beneath the core. So the containment effort really happened in 2 big stages.
The first one, called the shelter object, was a desperate rush job they threw together in just 6 months back in 1986. It was only ever meant to last about 20 or 30 years. But 30 years later, it was covered by the new safe confinement, this colossal arch that was built nearby and then slowly slid over the top of the old structure. It's a true marvel of engineering, designed to last for over 100 years and hopefully allow for the eventual dismantling of what's left inside.
So the reactor was contained. The fire was out. The monster was buried. But this battle was won at an almost unimaginable human cost. It's why people often compare the Chernobyl cleanup to a war fought not against another army, but against the laws of physics themselves.
600,000. That is the estimated number of people who were officially classified as liquidators. This wasn't just the soldiers on the roof. It was the miners, the first responder firefighters, the scientists, the helicopter pilots who dropped sand on the fire, the doctors, absolutely everyone who was involved in the effort to contain the disaster. 600,000 people.
Valery Legasov, again, just perfectly summarized the fate of these liquidators. For most of them, the radiation dose they got wasn't quite high enough to kill them outright from acute radiation sickness. Instead, it was more like a delayed death sentence. The radiation had damaged their DNA, planting the seeds for cancers and other fatal diseases that would show up years or even decades down the line. Their sacrifice wasn't a quick death on a battlefield. It was a slow, invisible decay that would follow them for the rest of their shortened lives.
In the end, there's no question that the liquidators prevented a disaster that could have made huge parts of Europe uninhabitable for centuries. They saved millions of lives. But so many of their own lives were cut short or just shattered forever. And that leaves us with this really profound and honestly unanswerable question. When you're faced with an impossible choice, how do you even begin to measure the value of the human lives that were sacrificed to save countless others?